George Washington, Revolutionary War General, first President of the United States, and man with wooden teeth. Here are 12 myths that you still may believe about this legendary American hero. Myth number 1. George Washington had wooden teeth. Although some throughout history may have used wood to replace their teeth, George Washington was not one of these people. Washington had dental issues throughout his life, often mentioning his inflamed gums, his bad dentures, and aching teeth in his letters and diary entries. By the time he became president in 1789, he had only one original tooth left, though that one was eventually pulled in 1796 as well. Washington used many different materials for his full and partial dentures, including human and animal teeth, probably from cows and horses, ivory, possibly from elephants, walrus, and hippos, and metal alloys such as a lead-tin alloy, copper alloy, and silver alloy. Myth number 2. George Washington chopped down a cherry tree, probably Washington's most common misconception, often told to young children to make them more honest. Washington's story about receiving a hatchet, cutting down his father's cherry tree, and proclaiming that he couldn't lie was invented by Mason Locke Weems, one of Washington's first biographers. Mason published a book, The Life and Memorable Actions of George Washington, in 1800, just a year after Washington's death. However, that cherry tree story didn't appear until the 5th edition in 1806, unfortunately becoming a big hit that misinformed generations of American school children. Myth number 3. George Washington was a Democrat/Republican. Since Washington was the first president of the United States, the primary Democratic and Republican parties that we know today did not exist. In fact, the Republican Party would not arrive until over a half a century later in 1854. While the Democrat Party was founded in 1828. So neither of these parties were around when Washington was in office. The main political factions when Washington was in office were the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. However, Washington was not affiliated with any political party, being the only president to not have one, as he was concerned about political parties infecting popular sovereignty. Washington even stated, however, political parties may now and then answer popular ends. They are likely, in the course of time and things, to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. Myth number 4. George Washington wanted to be president. Despite being the first president of the United States, George Washington never actually planned on becoming the leader of the country. In fact, he was basically pressured into not just his first term, but his second term as well. However, since Washington was such an obvious first choice for president, as he was a national hero and president of the 1787 Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, Washington actually was retired at the time, stating, "No wish which aspires beyond the humble and happy lot of living and dying a private citizen." Washington's old age, his love of retirement, belief that others would be qualified, and his fear of looking ambitious were all reasons he gave for not wanting to accept the presidency. Even French general and friend of Washington, Marquis de Lafayette, tried to get him to be president, stating in a letter, "Not to deny your acceptance of the office of president for the first years." Washington replied, "Let those follow the pursuits of ambition and fame, who have a keener relish for them, or who may have more years in store for the enjoyment." Washington was tired and enjoyed his time at his plantation Mount Vernon, but despite not wanting to become president, he could not escape his conscience, and accepted the presidency. Myth number 5. George Washington lived in the White House. We all know that the president lives in the White House today, but the first president, George Washington, never actually lived there. In fact, he didn't even live in Washington, D.C., because they simply did not exist at the time. Washington actually lived in a New York mansion facing the East River at 1 Cherry Street. And then in 1790, he moved to a more convenient location on Broadway, close to Trinity Church. Washington did, however, help build the Capitol, passing the Residence Act, which called for the permanent capital of the United States to be located on the Potomac River, allowing his successor, John Adams, to become the first president to live in the White House, although at the time it was called the Executive Mansion, President's House, or President's Palace. Myth number 6. George Washington asked Betsy Ross to make the design for the first American flag. In 1776, Washington and 3 members of the Continental Congress visited Betsy Ross in her upholstery shop in Philadelphia and asked Ross to make a new flag for the rebellious colonies. Ross suggested making stars with 5 points instead of 6 and created a sample flag, which became the new banner of their colonies. This myth became widespread in the 19th century, mainly due to Ross's descendants. But while Ross was known to create flags, there's practically no historical evidence to suggest that she designed the first American flag. Myth number 7. George Washington is buried in a crypt beneath the US Capitol. In his will, Washington specifically outlined his desire to be buried at his home of Mount Vernon, along with his wife Martha and the rest of the Washington family. However, the crypt in the US Capitol building was at one time intended to be a burial place of the first president. Myth number 8. George Washington once skipped a silver dollar all the way across the Potomac River. Washington was a very athletic and tall man. By the way, check out my video on all presidents' heights. But no one, living or dead, has ever had the strength to throw a silver dollar over a mile across the Potomac River at Mount Vernon. And even if he did have the strength to throw the coin a mile when he was younger, it wouldn't have been a silver dollar coin, as the first silver dollar coin was minted in 1794, when he was a much older man. However, his step-grandson recounted a story in which Washington did hurl a piece of slate against the Rappahannock River in Fredericksburg, which is a much more plausible feat, as the Rappahannock River is a much narrower river than the Potomac. Myth number 9. George Washington created the presidential 2-term law. This myth is semi-true, as George Washington stepped down after just 2 terms as President of the United States. However, there is no official US law preventing candidates from running for more than 2 terms. Washington chose to step down partly due to simply not being interested, and partly due to his fear that if he died in office, others might see the presidency as a lifelong position. So he wanted to demonstrate a peaceful transfer of power. In 1951, the 22nd Amendment was ratified, stating, "No person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice, and no person who has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of the president more than once." Despite Washington's unwritten rule of only running for 2 terms, some presidents, including Theodore Roosevelt and Ulysses S. Grant, tried running for a 3rd term. However, only Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president again after 2 terms, actually serving 4 terms, from 1932 until his death in 1945. So George Washington's precedent of only 2 terms per president did eventually become law. He just personally didn't create it. Myth number 10. George Washington wore a white wig. Although many at the time did wear a white powdered wig, Washington did not, as he kept his own hair tied back in a bun or ponytail, but he did actually powder his own hair, giving it the white look we often see in his portraits. Before we get into our last 2 myths, consider becoming a channel member to get some great perks, including a special Discord role, priority reply to comments, emojis, and thumbnail sneak peeks. Myth number 11. George Washington was a military genius. There's no doubt that George Washington was a brilliant leader and military commander. However, compared to other military commanders, he does not hold up to the best of the best in terms of tactics. What made Washington such a great leader was his ability to adapt, improvise, and rally his troops. Washington's command can be summed up by the quote, "Lose the battle but win the war," as he actually lost more battles than he won. Myth number 12. George Washington knelt in prayer at Valley Forge. The story of a Quaker pacifist, Isaac Potts, stumbling on Washington kneeling in the snow and praying to God for his army's deliverance, causing him to join the revolutionary cause, is nothing more than a made-up tale by the same man who created the Cherry Tree story, Mason Locke Weems, who put the story in his 1804 edition of his Washington biography. While Washington was a devout Christian and Potts was a real person, little evidence suggests that these events took place, as Weems likely wrote about the story to illustrate the strength of the Revolutionary era values.